La 7820.
The 7,820th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is the situation in the Middle East, including the Palestinian question. The agenda is adopted. According to Article 39 of the Provisional Rules of Procedure of the Security Council, I invite the following to provide a briefing to the Security Council and to participate in this meeting. Mr. Nikolai Mladenov, Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process and Personal Representative of the Secretary General, and Mr. Stephen O'Brien, Under Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator. It is so decided. The Security Council will now turn to agenda item 2, and I give the floor to Mr. Nikolai Mladenov.
Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, President.
Members of the Security Council. As we stand here today, the continuing status quo in the occupied Palestinian territory reduces the prospect for sustainable and just peace between Israelis and Palestinians. Rarely have the risks to the two-state solution been greater than today. How many times have we said in this chamber that we must move past the blatant obstructionism, the false starts, and the perpetual claims that the time is simply not right for action? And action has a cost measured in human lives and suffering. The situation on the ground is changing steadily, dangerously, as proponents of Israeli settlement expansion feel emboldened, internal divisions among Palestinians flare up, and the prospect of a future Palestinian state becomes under threat like never before. The proponents of the status quo, Mr. President, the critics of the two-state solution offer no viable alternative that meets the legitimate national and historic aspirations of both Israelis and Palestinians. The alternative is an open-ended occupation, a perpetual conflict which breeds anger among the people of Palestine and Israel and feeds radicals across the Middle East torn already by ethnic and religious strife. Mr. President, socio-economic despair underpinned by the persistent hardships of the occupation and fragile democratic institutions are affecting stability in the West Bank and threatening to erode the achievements of the Palestinian state-building agenda. The stark reality is most visible in the Palestine refugee camps, which remain a symbol of the failure to produce a sustainable political solution to end the conflict and Palestinian suffering. I visited the West Bank city of Nablus twice this month to meet with the governor as well as with residents and representatives of the Balata refugee camp. Established in 1950 to serve some 5,000 refugees, Balata today is the home of almost 30,000 people, living on just a quarter square kilometer of land. Some 50% of its residents are reportedly unemployed, the majority of them youth. Poverty and food insecurity rates are the highest in the West Bank. The harsh conditions, combined with regular Israeli incursions and the lack of a permanent home, create the potential for violence. With growing political tension in the West Bank over the past months, we have witnessed a series of clashes between Palestinian security forces and residents of the camp and the nearby Old City. During recent operations, regrettably, one woman caught in the crossfire was killed and 15 people were injured, including 4 security personnel. The Palestinian Authority has an obligation to maintain law and order, including in the refugee camps. It does that, and it does that effectively and professionally under very challenging circumstances. It is critical that should force be used, it must be done judiciously. Those charged or arrested must be afforded due judicial process and treated equally under Palestinian law. The problems in the camps are a reflection of the deep socio-economic and political challenges, the resolution of which is not in the hands of the vulnerable Palestine refugees. They are foremost in the hands of Palestinian Israeli political leaders. Left without hope, mired in poverty, Palestine's most traumatized, its refugees, have seen their needs outpace the resources available to the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees, UNRWA. Generations of residents have been educated by UNRWA. Thousands have gained employment and a sense of security through its various activities. The most destitute have benefited from its relief program. But, Mr. President, I appeal to the international community to support UNRWA so that it can carry out its activities effectively and predictably. I welcome the generous commitments made by the United Arab Emirates and Kuwait, in addition to Canada's resumption of support for UNRWA. This support is indispensable to maintaining the lives of Palestine refugees and to the stability of the region. Mr. President, the situation in the camps, however, is only part of the story. If current socio-economic trends continue, the potential for a serious deterioration of the situation in the West Bank will grow. The Palestinian Authority faces fiscal difficulties as international assistance this year is down by some 30%. The PA is dependent on Israel for clearance revenues and on the international community for financial support. Economic development in the West Bank remains constrained by Israeli restrictions on access to the most fertile lands, water and mineral resources in Area C, which constitutes some 60% of the West Bank. While Israel has made important positive gestures, including retroactively legalizing 2 Palestinian schools and advancing a community outline plan for a Palestinian village in Area C near Jenin, such steps are only the beginning. They need to be expanded and encouraged. I welcome important discussions being held between the parties on critical issues, such as water and electricity, that built on agreements from the Ad Hoc Liaison Committee meeting in September here in New York. While progress is being made, it remains slow. It is critical that these discussions become operational realities in order to meet the dire needs of the West Bank and Gaza. It is in no one's interest to allow the Palestinian economy and stability to crumble. Only significant policy shifts by Israel and action by the Palestinians to strengthen their institutions and the rule of law can sustainably reverse this course. Mr. President, in its July report, the Middle East Quartet underscored the need for Palestinian unity, a single, democratic and legitimate government that unites Gaza and the West Bank. This remains critical for the fulfillment of Palestinian national aspirations. Sadly, this unity continues to remain an elusive goal. On November 29th, Fatah is scheduled to have its 7th party conference. This should be used as an opportunity for promoting unity, for strengthening the mainstream center of Palestinian politics and paving the way for elections. I urge all to conduct the proceedings in a fully transparent and representational manner that encourages moderate voices and respects opposing views. Mr. President, recent developments in Israel are increasingly worrying. Last week, despite strong opposition, the so-called legalization bill passed a preliminary vote in the Knesset. If adopted, the bill would enable the expansion of illegal settlements and outposts on private Palestinian land. If ratified, it would constitute a breach of international law, and according to Israel's own Attorney General, it would also be unconstitutional. Today, the local planning committee in Jerusalem decided to advance plans for 500 new housing units in the existing settlement of Ramat Shlomo, further encroaching into East Jerusalem's neighborhood of Beit Hanina. I once again urge Israel to adhere to the repeated calls to cease illegal settlement construction in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem. In recent weeks, Israel has also conducted over 80 demolitions of Palestinian structures in Area C and East Jerusalem for lack of building permits that are next to impossible for people to obtain. In this latest round, 122 people have been displaced. This year, to date, over 1,020 structures have been demolished, which is nearly twice last year's total. Mr. President, let me now turn to Gaza, where I continue to be deeply concerned by the continuing militant buildup, smuggling, and increased restrictions on the movement of people and goods in and out of the Strip. As I briefed the Council last month, the amount of construction materials entering Gaza is woefully inadequate in order to meet the vast reconstruction needs. Due to limitations imposed by Israel on imports and materials and approvals of construction projects, the volume of such building materials, primarily cement, has now fallen well behind demand. This creates tensions among approved beneficiaries over the limited availability in the market. At today's import rates, ladies and gentlemen, it would take at least 7 months to clear the current backlog of 33,000 households in Gaza who have been approved to purchase cement to repair and reconstruct their houses. Thousands of households have been waiting for months to access the material they need, and economic activity in the Gaza Strip is slowing down ominously. In October, at least 50% of the permit applications to exit Gaza were denied for national staff of international aid agencies alone, in sharp contrast to the average of less than 5% of denials in 2015. This has significant impact for the ability of the UN and the humanitarian community to deliver and monitor ongoing programs. While acknowledging Israel's security concerns, I urge it to address this pressing issue without delay. I also welcome recent Egyptian efforts to relieve the suffering of the people in Gaza. The opening of the Rafah crossing for 10 days this month enabled thousands, including students and those seeking urgent medical attention, to cross into Egypt, and over 2,000 Palestinians to return back home in the Gaza Strip. Mr. President, turning briefly to Lebanon, there have been further signs since the Council was last briefed on November 10th of the country overcoming its political crisis. Following the election of President Aoun, progress has been made towards the formation of a government under the leadership of Prime Minister Saad Hariri. It is hoped that this positive momentum will translate into full reactivation of institutions, including parliamentary elections by May 2017. The situation in the UNIFIL area of operations remains unchanged, mostly quiet, with some violations by both sides. UNIFIL's investigation into the firing incident across the Blue Line on the 26th of October near Kafr Kela is ongoing. In a tripartite meeting, Israel and Lebanon reaffirmed their commitments to the calm and stability along the Blue Line. On the Golan, I remain concerned by the current precarious situation which undermines the 1974 disengagement of forces agreement and clearly jeopardizes the ceasefire between Israel and the Syrian Arab Republic. I urge both parties to maintain liaison with UNDOF and to refrain from any action that could escalate the situation across the ceasefire line and the already volatile regional environment. Mr. President, as the situation in the West Bank continues to deteriorate, as Gaza's chronic challenges show little sustainable progress, and as the voices of extremism on all sides intensify their efforts to destroy any remaining hope in the two-state solution, I would like to conclude with a call to both parties and all stakeholders to stand up to those promoting a hate-driven agenda that threatens to prolong this conflict. A carefully worded statement or a well-crafted speech will not reverse the current trajectory. What people long for is concrete action. They need to see a plan to rebuild trust and create the conditions for a return to meaningful negotiations by focusing on positive changes on the ground and an engagement with the region. They need the international community to restate its consensus that the two-state solution is the only outcome that legitimately meets the national aspirations of both peoples, and to speak clearly against the obstacles to peace: settlements, the taking of land, violence, and incitement. They need to hear from us that development cannot be a substitute for statehood, that democracy, human rights, and the rule of law must be respected. They need courageous Israeli and Palestinian leaders who together can chart a clear strategy to peace and security. I urge all those who are committed to ending this conflict, including this Council, to consider carefully what it will take to advance the prospects of peace and to begin, in consultation with the parties, to develop an agreed path forward. Time is running out, Mr. President. Palestinians and Israelis deserve to live in peace. We must spare no effort in helping them reach that goal. As ever, the United Nations remains committed to advancing this objective. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Nikolai Mladenov for his briefing. And I give the floor now to Mr. Stephen O'Brien.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. President, and members of the Council. I thank my colleague, Mr. Nikolai Mladenov, for his authoritative and comprehensive briefing, and I shall complement his remarks on the humanitarian situation in the OPT. And last month, I also provided an overview of the humanitarian situation in the occupied Palestinian territory. And today, I will focus my remarks on the increasing challenges humanitarian actors are facing in responding to the needs of these vulnerable Palestinians, and for which we need greater support from this Council. Mr. President, in the occupied Gaza Strip, 70% of the population currently receives some form of international assistance, mostly food aid. Yet our ability to deliver that assistance has become increasingly restricted. Israel bans or restricts for import into Gaza certain goods on the grounds that they have a dual military and civilian purpose. Affected items range from communications equipment to cement, wood, and even water pumps, fire trucks, and medical X-ray machines. Mr. Mladenov has already spoken about the growing and dramatic gap between how much material Israel is permitting to be imported to Gaza through the Gaza reconstruction mechanism and the growing waiting lists of beneficiaries. This translates very directly into the humanitarian realm, with still 60,000 highly vulnerable, displaced persons in Gaza waiting for their home to be rebuilt and needing rental assistance and much more in the interim. It's not just about concrete. Urgent projects which aim to reduce the risk of flooding that threatens nearly 500,000 people as winter approaches have been on hold for 10 months, awaiting clearance of equipment. Projects to rehabilitate water wells and the construction of a neonatal intensive care unit are other examples of urgent needs suffering unnecessary long delays. And aid workers have also been caught in the increased restrictions. UN staff in Gaza require a permit in order to leave Gaza to meet with their managers in Jerusalem or Ramallah or to attend training programs elsewhere. Whilst these permits were relatively easy to receive in previous years, when never more than 10% were typically rejected, last month more than half of our UN applicants were turned away, with some advised not to apply for 12 months. No explanation other than, quote, security, close quotes, is cited, leaving us at a loss as to how to respond and a growing morale problem. NGOs, embassies, and others are experiencing similar trends. These new access restrictions are hitting other Gaza residents hard as well, of course. Over half of the 2,000 permit applications by patients seeking urgent medical treatment outside Gaza in October, most typically for cancer treatment, were not approved by Israel. Inside Gaza, the operating space for NGOs is also difficult. The de facto authorities, Hamas, regularly seek to do audits, review staff or beneficiary lists, or introduce new permit requirements and restrictions on work in certain areas of the Strip. NGOs need to resist these pressures and navigate anti-terrorist legislation in place by many member states, which generate their own restrictions on the type of programming that is allowed and with whom one can and can't engage. The ongoing internal divisions between the Palestinian authorities in the West Bank and those in Gaza also inevitably transfer an increasing burden onto humanitarian actors and humanitarian budgets, as unstaffed operating theatres, dilapidated equipment, and breaks in fuel supplies take their toll on people and services. Ultimately, real progress in Gaza requires a full lifting of the blockade by Israel, in line with the resolutions of this Council and the General Assembly. Until that happens, Israel must ensure that items needed for reconstruction, relief, and emergency preparedness are allowed entry, and that aid workers are able to move about to do their vital work. Whilst it is not a substitute for the opening of access to Israel, we also look to Egypt, in line with its own security considerations, to maintain the welcome increase in openings at the Rafah crossing, which remains literally a lifeline for some. And we must see greater action from Palestinian leaders in Ramallah and Gaza. Internal differences must be resolved for the sake of Palestine's most vulnerable constituents. Mr. President, in the occupied West Bank, as the pressures increase on communities in Area C, so too do the obstacles to our operations there as well. As I have reported to this Council before, the pace of demolitions and confiscations of Palestinian property by the Israeli authorities has far exceeded any previous years on record, more than double this year as compared to 2015. These have occurred mainly within herding communities in Area C, which count amongst Palestine's most vulnerable households. Obstruction to our operations in these areas is occurring in the most egregious way, with our relief items themselves frequently demolished or confiscated by Israeli forces. The rate of demolition or seizure of such donor-funded relief is on a trajectory to potentially triple as compared to 2015. Affected relief items include shelters and tents, water cisterns, animal pens, and other basic structures for survival and livelihoods. More fundamentally, Palestinians in Area C are living in an increasingly coercive environment created by discriminatory planning policies, demolitions, the active promotion of plans to relocate Bedouin to new townships, and other practices that generate miserable living conditions and create pressure on people to move elsewhere. Much of this occurs in the line of sight of new or expanding Israeli settlements, illegal under international law as reiterated by successive resolutions by this Council. About 1/4 of the structures targeted this year were in Palestinian Bedouin communities located within or near the area allocated to the E1 settlement expansion project on the outskirts of occupied East Jerusalem. It is critical that the interests of these vulnerable Bedouin communities are placed first. They need and deserve our unequivocal support to resist these coercive pressures by the occupying power and must not be burdened by still more pressures from Palestinian leaders, some of whom appear to view these communities as a key battleground in Palestine's long struggle. These vulnerable civilians have no place as instruments in a political strategy. I reiterate the Secretary-General's call to Israel to end the policies and practices that place these Palestinians at risk of forcible transfer. And I remind the Palestinian authorities also of the need to respect the principles of independence, impartiality, neutrality, and humanity that are the bedrock of the humanitarian imperative. Mr. President, the continued lack of a resolution to the core drivers of this ongoing humanitarian crisis has left Palestinians stuck in a perpetual cycle of humanitarian relief, increasingly dependent on assistance, facing an ongoing lack of respect for their rights and heightened instability. We need a coherent international response that will enhance the protection of civilians and deliver accountability for violations of international humanitarian law and international human rights law. This is especially important in the absence of an active political process between Israeli and Palestinian leaders. Israel, the main duty bearer, is a signatory to the Fourth Geneva Convention and has clear obligations as an occupying power. And both Israel and Palestine have ratified the major human rights treaties. They are bound by customary international law as well as are all countries. The members of this Council have a vital role to play in motivating the parties to respect their obligations. Similarly, all parties to the Geneva Conventions have an obligation not only to respect, but also to ensure the respect by others of these conventions. So, Mr. President, the challenges facing Palestinians in the occupied Palestinian territory and those facing humanitarians trying to assist them require not only action from Israeli and Palestinian authorities, but from every member of this Council. If we want to prevent further deterioration in a region already overwhelmed with humanitarian emergencies, your decisive collective action is vital. If it would help the members of this Council to have a specific list of humanitarian relief actions that need to be taken or avoided, then I and my colleagues will be pleased to provide you with them. However, these actions notwithstanding, the principles of international humanitarian law do and must apply. This includes all members of this Council, all those in the occupied Palestinian territory, both the Israelis and the Palestinians, and all who have signed these international legal obligations to which they are and must be held accountable. Namely, we look to you to ensure greater respect for obligations under international humanitarian law and international human rights law and to enhance the protection of civilians. We look to you to safeguard the operational space aid workers require to provide assistance to those most in need. And we look to you to address the underlying driver of Palestine's protection crisis through a political resolve to end the occupation, now approaching its 50th anniversary. Thank you.
I thank Mr. O'Brien for his statement. The representative of Uruguay has requested the floor to make a statement. You have the floor, Your Excellency.
Gracias.
Thank you very much, President. My delegation would like to thank Messrs. Mladenov and O'Brien for their testimonies, because these go a great deal further than mere briefings. These are eyewitness accounts or testimonies about a situation that is not a situation of déjà vu. I'm not sure that we can use that terminology. Some might wish to. Déjà vu implies, however, that the situation is static and unchanged. However, this is not the case here. It's not static. It's simply deteriorating. We listened very carefully to the last words from Mr. O'Brien, his most recent testimony. And there was a time when I was listening to USJ O'Brien, President, when I wasn't sure whether we were talking about Israel, Palestine and Gaza, or whether we were talking about Syria, Sudan, South Sudan, or Yemen, because the obstructions to development and to tasks being carried out by UN organizations on the ground, the hampering of humanitarian assistance in particular in all of these areas, is something that we have denounced in the Security Council repeatedly with regards to Sudan, South Sudan and Yemen. But we're seeing the same things at play here in Israel-Palestine. Actions that we've condemned in Syria, Sudan, South Sudan are being carried out by the government of Israel in Israel-Palestine. And for many years now, we have borne witness to that, and we have responded to it, but we are not heeded. So my delegation has requested other governments to cease or desist from interfering with humanitarian aid and to desist from hindering the delivery of humanitarian aid. We have made that point loud and clear as a government to many other governments or to many other groups that participate in such practices. And so we make the same point loud and clear and with the same robust spirit to the government of Israel and to the authorities of Palestine. The Security Council cannot treat people differently for the same actions. Around this table, we have heard passionate declarations denouncing the desperate situation that follows in the wake of preventing the delivery of humanitarian aid to various areas of Syria, for example. The same thing that we're seeing in Syria with regard to humanitarian aid is happening in Israel and Palestine, and that was made abundantly clear in Mr. O'Brien's briefing. And on the basis of that reality, we, in the strongest possible terms, as we do with every other situation where humanitarian aid is hampered, we make the same appeal to the relevant authorities in this particular conflict that they desist from such activities and that they desist from preventing humanitarian aid getting through. Uruguay is alarmed at the absolute lack of progress in the Israel-Palestine conflict, which has consequences, of course, at the humanitarian, political and security level in both countries and, of course, spills over into the entire region. Once again, President, we reiterate our support for Israel and Palestine's right to live in peace within secure and recognized borders in an atmosphere of renewed cooperation and free of any threat or act which could threaten the peace. We repeat our belief in the fact that the only solution is two independent states. This is the only option which will allow for peaceful coexistence of Israel and Palestine. It is up to the parties to foster the necessary conditions for the resumption of negotiations, and they must also take political action which demonstrates their commitment to the two-state solution. It is essential that the parties refrain from adopting unilateral actions which would hamper such dialogue and which would serve to further undermine international law. We continue to be concerned by ongoing decisions by the Israeli authorities to pursue their settlement policy in the occupied Palestinian territories in the West Bank. We are also concerned about the ongoing policy of destruction of Palestinian housing. Once again, we make the point loud and clear that these settlements are illegal under international law, and we call upon Israel to immediately desist from such a settlement practice and policy. Once again, we condemn in the strongest possible terms acts of terrorism as well as the glorification of said acts. We also condemn the deaths of unarmed Palestinians who have died at the hands of the Israeli security forces. Once again, President, we would like to repeat that the only solution that will deliver peace is direct bilateral negotiations between the Israelis and the Palestinians that would allow us to finally end this conflict, which now, some nearly 7 decades from when it began, still remains unresolved. Thank you very much, President. I thank the permanent representative of Uruguay for his statement, says the President, and I give the floor now to the permanent representative of Venezuela.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to thank you for convening this session, and I would like to, following the example of Uruguay, I'd like to just express a few views here in the public session before we move into consultations. I'd like to thank Mr. O'Brien and Mr. Mladenov. And I just wanted to say that once again, as we do every month, we have witnessed or we've heard another report about the Palestinian tragedy and the longest unresolved case on the agenda of the Security Council. We have beat the sad record of a clear lack of will by this council to present a positive solution, to provide a positive solution to this tragedy. We would like to express our deepest rejection and indignation regarding the permanent policy of aggression of the Israeli state against the Palestinian people and the occupation of their territory. It is surprising that Israel is one of the few countries in the world, maybe 2 or 3, that constantly disregard resolutions of the Security Council, and that in violation of all the resolutions of the United Nations and of this Council is moving forward with a flagrant and illegal policy of colonization of Palestinian territory. The status quo, which is unsustainable, as every single delegation in this council has stated, continues to deepen and continues to undermine the two-state solution. We would like to state that this situation of the occupation of Palestinian territory requires the reestablishment of the full rights of the Palestinian people to their free determination and sovereignty, and the withdrawal by Israel of all the occupied territories to the pre-1967 borders. We would like to once again strongly condemn the policy of settlement expansion by the occupying power. This policy and these settlements are not only illegal and counter all international law and resolutions, but are also part of a continuous strategy by the occupying power aimed at colonizing Palestinian territory and expelling Palestinians from their land. We believe that the latest decisions by the Israeli government to try using legal subterfuges to legalize settlements require a strong response by this council, a resounding response. We don't know, Mr. President, how long we'll be able to ask Palestine to continue to be patient. How long will the Palestinian Authority and the Palestinian people will continue to wait until the Security Council agrees on a strategy? We're in a situation where this Security Council is shirking its responsibility. As elected members of the Security Council until the end of December of this year, we believe that this is the time for the Security Council, due to the the many states involved in dealing with the Palestinian problem, including Senegal, who's member of the Committee for the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People, representing Africa. I think that the conditions are there to at least for the Council to at least adopt a resolution in order to denounce the settlements as illegal and to insist that Israel complies with the international law. I want to just underscore that at the last meeting of informal consultations that we had with representatives of Israeli civil society, one of the speakers said that part of the problem and part of the reason why the Israeli government acts with impunity is that there is no international response to the violations of the provisions of the Security Council and the United Nations. There's no response, and so the Israeli authorities are acting as though they have the support, or at least the green light, of some of the members of the Security Council. In particular, we would like to make an appeal to the U.S. delegation, so that we're in a transition to a new administration, and the President Obama is still in power. He has perhaps a final opportunity to say something in favor of the Palestinian people, in favor of legality and the rule of law. And finally, we can't not mention the humanitarian situation in the occupied territories, the situation of extraordinary violence that the occupying power is carrying out against the Palestinian people. Over 7,000 Palestinians are languishing in Israeli prisons. Over 700 men, women, and children are subject to administrative detention. And in particular, we want to raise our voice to mention Israeli Palestinian children who are being thrown into Israeli jails simply because they are expressing their opposition to Israeli occupation and the violence of Israel against their people. We also want to say that the policy of settlements and the expansion of settlements, in addition to that, what we're seeing is that there's most extremist settlers are being given prominence in Israeli policy, those that are carrying out daily violence against the Palestinian people. And finally, Mr. President, we would like to make another appeal to the Security Council and to all the members of the Security Council. Let's be brave and make a clear and brave decision, and clearly reject what Israel is doing in the occupied territories, and to express our support for all diplomatic efforts, including the report of the Quartet led by Russia and France, and other initiatives I think deserve the wholehearted support of the Security Council. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the Permanent Representative of Venezuela for his statement. There are no further speakers on the list. I would now like to invite the members of the Council to continue discussing this item in consultations. Thank you. The meeting is adjourned.